Tonight's talk is about the Bladons, the most important Uttoxeter family you've never heard of. This covers the family's arrival in Uttoxeter and their various business ventures and how they shaped the town that we live in today. Rising to prominence during the 1700s, the family had multiple interests throughout the town, but this faded away, and today very little of their legacy is left. The talk tonight is presented by our trustee and one of our resident historians, Dave Marriott. And I will hand over to Dave. So over to you, Dave.
Okay. Thanks, Gordon. Good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining us this evening for this talk on the Bladons. A slightly unusual one in many respects. Gordon said the most important Uttoxeter family that you never heard of. You can see the opening slide said the most powerful Uttoxeter family that you've never heard of. I'll give you a bit of background to where all this comes from. A lot of the source material for the presentation is based on 30 years of family research by my friend and colleague at the museum, Helena Coney, who is a Bladon by descent. Over those 30 years, Helena has collected in a huge archive of material, original material about the family. And what we've been doing over the last 2 or 3 years is to match that family history with the local history of Uttoxeter, to set the Bladons in context, because like the slide implies, most people have never heard of them. But when you start digging quite deeply into the local history sources for the town, you'll see that signature on my first slide, and the name Bladon appear very often over a certain period of time. So what we've been able to do then is matched family and local history together, and this is their story, not researched at all until Helena and latterly myself did all the work. So hopefully it will give you an insight not only about the family and their rise to wealth, but also about the Uttoxeter in which they lived. So let's make a start. One of the things that you often find, this is frozen. Sorry, the slides have just frozen. Let's just start that again. Sorry, go on. The slides have just frozen. Not a good start. There we go. One of the prompts, I suppose, to looking at their place within the town is in St Mary's Parish Church in town. When you visit a church, as many of you can do and can do very much so in the next months ahead as we open again, you often stare at the walls and you see these marble plaques, remembering those people that were very much important in the church and indeed in the town. And in St Mary's in Uttoxeter, as you walk down the main aisle, towards the right-hand side, you'll see a range of plaques, all with the Bladon name on them, except the far right one, which is Joseph Bladon, which appears high up on its own, way up on the first floor of the church. When you look at the plaques, these are not small. These are very significant pieces of marble. They are in a very prominent place in the church and therefore suggest that these people were both in their day wealthy and extremely important in the town. So it gives you some idea, when you do walk into a church, which people in the past have been important, and certainly for Uttoxeter, it was the Bladons. So that's what we're going to be doing is covering this time span, really. We're going to start with John Bladon, who died in 1702, and we'll finish right down towards the bottom right hand corner with Thomas III around about 1868. And you'll notice, unfortunately, that the Bladons passed on the same Christian name to their eldest son. So there's lots of Thomases, and you'll see we've labelled them up 1, 2, and 3. And just so that you know which Thomas I'm talking about at any one time, you'll see this slide appear again a number of times in the talk, and it will also show which a little arrow as to which one I'm talking about at that time. So they're the ones that we're talking about. So we're going to start with John right at the top. John basically lived in the Sudbury area on the Sudbury estate, and he was a farmer. But like many farmers, both in our area, farming was a precarious occupation. It was precarious in terms of the weather, the soil type on which they were farming, and therefore in most farms there was a secondary occupation. And in many farms, including many around here, that secondary occupation was actually something to do with the weaving or production of woolen cloth. It's not to suggest at all that Uttoxeter or the Dove Valley was a major wool producing area. It's never been. As I look out the window in Lee at the moment, I can see sheep in the field, and there were sheep in many fields for many hundreds of years around Uttoxeter. But that is not to say that it's a major wool producing area like the Cotswolds or parts of Yorkshire. It's a minor industry, but for the town and the area, important. And for John Bladon, it was important for him because it gave him a secondary income, something that would supplement whatever he can make of the land and generate some money for his family. He dies, John, in 1702, and Helen has managed to find the inventory that goes with his will, and the details are those that you can see in front of you. He's not a rich man by any means, and you can see there's a whole range of agricultural implements, and all his furniture is listed. If you ever get a chance, if you're interested in family history, if you get a chance to look at inventories rather than just wills, they're absolutely fascinating. The important thing about John's is the fact that you'll see I've highlighted halfway along that there's 2 pairs of looms and gears at a value of £1 and 2 shillings. And it suggests, therefore, that John owned his own looms, and suggests, therefore, that the production of wool cloth, or certainly wool, the weaving of wool, was really important to him and his family. It's on the basis of wool that the Bladons start to build their wealth. It doesn't start with John. He dies very young. I think he's in his early 30s when he dies, and he has children that are very young, and I've obviously been brought up in a household where the weaving of wool is important. On his death, his wife remarries and moves to Uttoxeter, and his sons do similar. Some stay in the Sudbury area in Hill Somersault or Somersault Herbert as well, but some of them actually move into Uttoxeter because that is the most important place that is near to them. It's difficult to imagine that Uttoxeter could be described as this description does. This description comes from a map that was published in the 1700s at the time of John Bladon. This is in its corner and is a commentary really on the importance of Uttoxeter, or Uttoxeter as we locals would like to call it. And you'll notice in that second sentence, the market is said to be one of the greatest in England, and it's incredibly difficult, even outside of a COVID environment, to imagine that Uttoxeter is one of the greatest towns in England. But in fact, it was. At the late 17th century, the late 1600s, and the early 18th century, Uttoxeter was incredibly important as a town. It probably was one of the most important, one of the largest towns in Staffordshire at the time because of its market. And it was drawing in people from miles and miles and miles around, both to trade and also to buy their goods for their everyday lives. So it's incredibly important. And if you were therefore wanting to look for work and set yourself up in business, it was the place to be. One of the things that was so attractive about Uttoxeter, and this quote, "a place of national consequence," also is of the time of the early 1700s, was the fact that it was for the time a very built-up town and offered a range of facilities. This map, which is the Peter Lightfoot map of 1658, gives an impression of the town at that time. You will notice that the street pattern is almost identical to what it is now. There is the marketplace. This is what my cursor is pointing out what I'm talking about. This is Carter Street, there's Bladon Street, and there's the High Street. So very, very similar to the pattern there was now. The interesting thing about Lightfoot's map, which is basically a survey of property in Uttoxeter 1658, is the density of building. Even though we're not quite sure whether these are absolutely accurate in terms of the number of buildings that there are on each of the streets, there was a high density of building, and therefore there was a high density of buildings available for people migrating into the town. So Uttoxeter was a draw to the surrounding area, to anybody that wanted to learn a trade, and also for them to set up in business. And that's exactly what the sons of John Bladon decided to do. They would move into Uttoxeter, and this would be the place where they would practice the skills that they no doubt had picked up from their dad, and set themselves up in business somewhere near to that marketplace. To give you an idea of how important Uttoxeter was at this time, we have these statistics. These have been gained from the parish records. The parish clerk at the time kept very detailed records, and it shows you that at the end of the 18th century there were 287 tradesmen. These are people that have a specific trade. These are not agricultural labourers. These are people that made and constructed things and produce. And the most important three on which the wealth of Uttoxeter was built was leather, textiles, and food and drink. Leather probably will be the subject of another talk. Textiles is in there, and almost exclusively the textile was wool. The food and drink is predominantly cheese. Uttoxeter at that time was one of the major cheese producing areas of the country, not just the local area, of the country. And therefore it was a place that obviously was attracting huge numbers of tradesmen to learn their trade, to develop their trade and go into business. So it was the natural place for Edward, particularly Edward, who's one of John's sons, to set himself up in business. So Edward Bladon, the eldest son of John, who comes to Uttoxeter, sets himself up as a woolstapler. He describes himself as a woolstapler. And essentially this slide that you see is in a workshop of a woolstapler. What he's doing in this shop is both stapling and weaving. It's the preparation of the wool before it's then woven, before it's spun, and then woven into cloth. Now these activities would have taken place often in the house in which Edward and anybody else involved in the industry was based, often in what were called shops. And if you look at some of the older houses in Uttoxeter, particularly around the Church Street area, then you will notice that you will have shops and buildings of 3 stories, and in the top you will notice there also is a range of small windows. And a lot of these Woolstaplers set themselves up in the top of these buildings, and the attics are often open so that one household can share the production process with the next household. And that's exactly what Edward did. Where was he? Well, he set himself up as close as possible to the marketplace. And those that don't know Uttoxeter, I'll give you just a bit of a tour. This is an enlarged section from Peter Lightfoot's map. So there's St Mary's Church that you can see quite prominent over here, and there you can also see that you've got this area around here. This is what we know as Bridge Street. So where the cursor is at the moment is about where Waitrose now is. So you'll notice on this map it wasn't called Bridge Street then, and up you come, and you come to this area here, and this area, as locals will know, is called Bear Hill, often thought to be named after the bear baiting that took place actually on that site. So this building here is about where the War Memorial now is, because originally the marketplace had a building right across this end of it. So that's sort of Domino's Pizza where my cursor is at the moment. So Edward Bladon, sorry, sets himself up on Bear Hill. We're not quite sure where, but we know that there were a number of wool workers and wool staplers around the Bear Hill area, and also here, which is around Church Street. So he's around here, and you'll see as we go through the talk, then essentially this is the area that begins the Bladon Empire. The area around Bear Hill in Uttoxeter is the area that's most important to them. What we've also found is that not only is Edward involved in the wool production, but also as he has children, then so are his sons. This little advert, dated the 23rd of April 1756, is for a John Bladon. Now John Bladon is Edward Bladon's son. So Edward Bladon moves into Uttoxeter, sets up business on Bear Hill, but there also seems to be, we've discovered, a set of linked premises, and this is one of John Bladon, and as you can see from reading it, he's a dyer in Uttoxeter, but he set up a freezing mill, a dyeing mill in Roaster. John's brother James also sets himself up in a similar mill, but this time in Ashbourne. So it seems that not only is Edward making a real go of being a wool stapler and a wool product producer, but his sons are involved in it as well. We've got no evidence of how these companies, these premises were linked, but it is highly likely that the family had a set of linked and connected premises. Where their business was coming from, who knows? You'll notice that they were obviously advertising that they were as cheap as any that you could get in London. So they thought that they were worthy producers. And it's highly likely that a lot of the trade was being generated by the wars with France at the time, which were generating huge demand for uniforms, all of which were made of wool. And of course, the main textile at the time is wool. So most people's clothes were made of wool. And you've also got in Uttoxeter a range of industries that were feeding off each other and needed, therefore, the raw material of one industry to feed another industry. And many of them demanded wool. So there was quite a trade going on between tradesmen, but you can see that there's sort of a retail section that the company, the family company, was advertising. Edward dies in the late 1700s, and this is part of his will. This is his signature, and that's interesting in many respects, because from what we can see, and what Helen has found out from all the family research that she's done, is unlike in many families where you often have got an X where they have to sign the name, the Bladons can write, and they always sign their name. So that, I'm sure, is a great advantage to them in the development of their business. This is some details of the will. What's interesting about it is that there is no mention in that will of his other sons, John and James, because he only provides in his will for those that he thinks have not already been provided for. The important one in the provision is this chap here. This is Thomas Bladon. This is the first of the Thomas Bladons, and it will be Thomas that therefore will take the business forward into something quite special. Thomas's brother John, who we think might also be connected into the main family business, seems to disappear though. This source in 1757 is about the fact that all the stock and trade of John Bladon, and clothier and dyer in Uttoxeter, is being sold, and we think it's being sold on his death. He's only a young chap, but sadly that part of the family business, if it disappears with the death of John. So let's have a look where we got to. So we've moved from John, a farmer and a part-time wool weaver in the Sudbury area, and his son Edward, who moves into Uttoxeter, and now Edward's son Thomas sets himself up in the same business as his father. Thomas, you will notice on the family tree diagram, has two wives. Sadly, his first wife, Mary Sargent, dies at a young age, and he remarries. The important thing about the Bladons is that they seem to marry into some money. It's very difficult to know where the money for this business expansion comes from. It might be from loans. Well, we know it is from some loans, but we also know that they were marrying into some money. And those families into which they were marrying would probably have invested in the developing business of Thomas. So Thomas does very, very well. He takes his father's business, develops it, and he does incredibly well with it in Uttoxeter, and bases it in this area. Now, this is Bear Hill, a contemporary shot, obviously. So this is Bear Hill, and these buildings, those that know Uttoxeter will know these buildings very well, are buildings that are on the site of the Bladon business. So essentially, the retail, the front, which would have been nothing like a shop front in the way that this one is that I'm highlighting here, the retail side would have faced straight onto the marketplace, and this is obviously the marketplace, and the market's just through these alleys and around the corner here. Such an important and prominent position to be in. Absolutely ideal. And over time, they go from small number of premises here to take all these premises here, all the ones here. Not necessarily these buildings themselves. These are slightly later, these buildings, but certainly the footprint of those buildings were Bladon land, and including the rear as well. So the buildings originally would have probably looked a bit like this. They would have been they would have been thatched. This is not a Bladon building. This is actually on Carter Street in Uttoxeter, and represents the sorts of buildings that existed throughout the town at the time. And we know that the Bladon buildings were also made of wattle and daub and were thatched. And we know this because of a newspaper article which reports a fire in the premises. Fires in Uttoxeter were, like most 18th century towns, even into the 19th century, were not uncommon. They happened all the time, and because the buildings at that time were close together, the chances of the fire moving between one building and the next was very great. The town, in fact, has suffered two very significant fires in its history, and at a time before the Bladons. One that largely destroyed St Mary's Church, and the second one that destroyed most of what we now know as Ballon Street. But we know from the Derby Mercury of 1777 that there was a fire at the Bladon premises, and you can also see that it tells us something about its construction. It was thatch, but fortunately it was put out before it did too much damage. This is not Uttoxeter, but this is an intriguing part of what we've discovered about Thomas Bladon. The business is obviously doing very, very well, and he seems to be connected to Nottingham. This is Nottingham at around 1802, something like that. We know this because in the research that we've done, we see an advert in the Derby Telegraph where Thomas Bladon is looking for apprentices and people to work as wool sorters. But he's looking for them not just in Uttoxeter, but also in Nottingham. And by digging around and doing a lot of peripheral research, we found that in fact Thomas and the Bladon business seems to be not in partnership, but certainly doing some subcontracting work in a very large mill. This is not the mill, but this one very similar, a very large mill set up by two entrepreneurs in Nottingham who were obviously wanting to make as much money as possible out of the wool cloth producing industry, but didn't necessarily have the expertise to do it. So it appears they subcontracted part of this space to Thomas Bladon. And there's evidence that his son, by his first wife, was in the area at that time, probably managing that branch of the business. We have very little detail about what went on in his part of the business anyway, but it gave them an insight into very large scale production, and an insight probably into the amount of money that very large scale production actually demanded, and probably put them off for life because they never went into large scale production of woolen goods. But it gave them an insight as to what those that were involved in large scale production might want from their suppliers. And it appears that the Bladons were suppliers of woolen goods, probably raw materials, almost acting as wholesalers to other producers. And that's where their wealth increases. So we know that the Bladon business was there. We've seen this slide before, but it also a contemporary slide. It also stretched all the way down what we now know as Bridge Street. This was originally called Schoolhouse Lane. So this would have been a Bladon premises, and Waitrose is down there. And all these little cottages, I haven't got a shot of those cottages on this presentation. Those cottages, that those that know the town well will know, these cottages were Bladon cottages. The other side of the road over here, where the old Wheat Sheaf pub is boarded up, a lot of this land around the back here and on this wasteland here was also Bladon premises. What's interesting, though, that Thomas Bladon obviously made an incredible success of the business, but he was a very astute businessman, because he transferred the ownership of the business to his son, also called Thomas, late in his life, so that when it came to his death and the value of his estate, which was considerable, it seems actually on paper that the estate was only worth £20, because to avoid tax, it had all been transferred to the other members of the family. So it's very, very astute. So we now come on to, therefore, the next layer of the Bladons. And this is Thomas I had, through his second wife, Anne Taylor, also a Thomas, and that's Thomas II. You'll also notice I've highlighted Joseph. Now it's Thomas II and Joseph Bladon that really take the Bladons up several notches, both in business and in their social rank within Uttoxeter society. Both of them are obviously very astute. Both of them have connections everywhere. And what we found, therefore, in doing the research is that there's almost nothing that goes on in Uttoxeter in their time that hasn't got their name on it. Not just anything, not just things to do with wool, but anything at all to do with the town. And you'll see some details of that in a moment. Where does all the money come from? Well, this odd slide might also suggest some important connections to the Bladons. Just like, you know, it was important in Jane Austen novels for females to marry into a wealthy, marry a wealthy husband, it was also important for a young gentleman to marry into somewhere that had wealth. And Thomas too certainly did that. Now you see there's the Talbot pub. He married the daughter of the landlord of the Talbot, and at that time the Talbot, I'm sure it's still, you know, in non-COVID times, it's still quite profitable, but was an incredibly profitable business, because there were no other big spaces in town to hold any big meetings or gatherings, so the pubs were very, very important. The old Talbot was even the site of the local court for a while. So he's marrying into money, somebody that's been very prosperous, but she's also connected to two other important and wealthy families in town. The middle one shot is obviously of jewelry, and his second wife is also connected into a family called the Copestakes. Now the Copestakes had a very significant jewelry business, so significant in where it was that the street name was changed to reflect their dominance in that area. So Silver Street, those that know the town, actually takes its name from the jewelry business that the Copestakes set up, which was about opposite where Thomas Alane's high school is, and where tyre service is. So from tyre service all the way down to Dove Bank was originally a very large building, had been a very grand house that the Copestakes had set up as a jewelry business, and we'll probably in another talk about them. But they were doing very well. She was also related, his wife, to the Vernons, and the Vernons were cork producers. Cork was a very significant industry at the time for Uttoxeter. for not just for plugging bottles, but for containers. And John Vernon, who was a very important nonconformist, and set up the United Reformed Church that those that know the town will know is on Carter Street, was also a very wealthy man. So what we're saying, I suppose, is the money's coming from connections by marrying into the right families. This rare surviving bill is from the shop of Thomas Bladon. It dates from the 1830s, 1840s. It's interesting in many respects because it gives us an idea as to what they were doing. They describe themselves, you see, as mercers and drapers. And even though you can't see the detail, it talks about they supply carpets, blankets, feather beds, mattresses, and a whole range of other things that are related to, I suppose, a modern day haberdasherers or drapery company. And this is the list of items that they were supplying to this particular customer, who we don't know who it is. You can see there's scarves and gloves, a whole range of ribbons and a whole range of things that are being supplied. So we now know by this time that the retail end is selling a whole range of goods, and it's an ideal place to be, because remember, Uttoxeter still at this time is attracting huge numbers of people, particularly on market days, to do their shopping, and this was their centre. So it was an ideal place to do business. Who they did business with in terms of wholesale is we don't know. We just don't know. But they're obviously doing very, very well, and they must have been doing more than just one shop. There's no evidence that there was another shop, but they must have been doing other activities related to the wool industry that was bringing in the money. We can say that because on these old photographs, we can now get some idea of the Bladon estate. You can see, for example, this is Bridge Street. So this old photograph is basically the arrows about where, get it over here, is about where Waitrose now is. This building, which is now the factory shop, was a Bladon warehouse. They own all these buildings down here and most of the buildings at the back. But in town, next to what is now the Old Wheatsheaf pub, they had this enormous warehouse. And there's photographs taken by John Dunnicliffe in the 1970s. Shows how big it is. This is a warehouse that's not just supplying one shop. This is a significant building, and therefore they must have been supplying a whole range of other people, both with finished goods and also, we think more so, raw materials, by actually probably semi-processing the wool and moving it on to somewhere else. So it wasn't just one shop. Their wealth wasn't being built on just one shop. But their wealth wasn't just built on wool. What we found, in fact, is that they were incredibly entrepreneurial when it came to owning land. There were huge numbers of land transactions going on that were involving the Bladons at this time. You can see there the numbers involved are enormous, and they were using their wealth, they're generated from their business and probably inherited, and also from family links, to buy property. And they became, at that time, probably the biggest landlords in town. And it was from their property empire that even more wealth was being generated. This map is quite rare. Essentially, it's drawn up by John White. He was a travelling map maker who came to towns and offered his services to anybody that wanted to pay for a map. What the maps show if you look at it in detail, is not everything is named, but you will also notice that there are some names of things that are on it, and some areas of the town that have a name. And the stars and the dots that are all over the map indicate from the map the name of Thomas Bladon. There it is. It's over here on the right hand side. You'll notice it in the centre. This is Thomas Bladon up here, Thomas Bladon up here, all around here. This is the centre of town and the marketplace. This is all Thomas Bladon property. This is Thomas Bladon. This is Joseph Bladon down here, and this is also a Bladon over here. This is just the beginnings of just a hint of what the property that they had in town. What's significant is the fact that their name appears, and it's significant because the way that the map works, is that because they're so expensive, they need patrons, and the patrons get their names on the map. So you'll notice that the Bladons are all over the map, therefore they must have been wealthy enough to pay for its, certainly towards its construction. If we dig a bit further, as Helena has, and with her, we've dug really deeply into property deeds in the town at the time, we found their empire is even bigger. This map is the tithe map of Uttoxeter from the 1840s. Needs a bit of explaining. Essentially, what the Victorians wanted to do is establish who owned what and how much was being paid for areas of land. So they set up the tithe survey, the tithe commutation survey in the 1840s, and they basically wanted to know who had what, where, and what it was worth for taxation, for the new taxation systems that they were going to introduce. So on this map, this is the town centre here, and we've looked at that for the previous map on the Bladon holdings. But we've also, through indentures and landholding details, also know that the Bladons owned all those areas that are coloured in here. And the key here shows you the range of the family. So anybody within the family seemed to own some land. This is Thomas and his brother Joseph and their sister Anne, and these are some of the sons of Thomas, all landowning. So they've got huge areas of land in the town centre, but you'll also notice they have huge areas of land around the town as well. In addition, they were land agents, we've found. This is St George's Chapel, Windsor. And you're probably thinking, what has this got to do with Uttoxeter? Well, those that know the town might also know that the patrons of St Mary's Church originally were St George's Chapel, Windsor. They essentially were given Uttoxeter in the 14th century, and they therefore owned both the church, St Mary's, and the land that went with it, its living. Now, what they therefore, and they still do, by the way, they are still the patrons of St Mary's Church in Uttoxeter. What they therefore did, however, they used a system of land agents. So Uttoxeter is not the only place, but we know obviously most about it, is that they used other people, particularly prominent landowners, to act as agents on their behalf, either for St George's Chapel to lease those agents the land, or for those agents to take the rents from those lands and take a cut. And the Bladons were the land agents for St George's Chapel, Windsor. This map and you can see them very interesting maps, we've acquired from the archives of St George's Chapel. There's still work that we've got to do on it, but the work that I've done recently, I think, illuminates quite a lot. Essentially, and the key is not that easy to follow, but anything in blue or blue shaded, so these areas there that are shaded, or solid blue, like these large areas here, are actually owned by St George's Chapel, Windsor, or were owned by St George's Chapel, Windsor. And therefore they collected the rents from those areas, or I should say that the Bladons collected the rents on their behalf and took a cut. So it therefore means what the Bladons are doing is both collecting rents from the land that they themselves own, but are also collecting a share of the rents for St George's Chapel, Windsor. And I do believe that actually there's some ground rents that's still paid from houses in Uttoxeter to St George's Chapel. Very interesting connection. So they were doing very well. So their wealth, in fact, is coming both from the wool business and also their property business, which is probably even bigger. It means by the early part of the 19th century, certainly the 1820s onwards, then the Bladons are becoming part of what are called middling people, part of the new middle class of Uttoxeter. This is the emerging characteristics of towns and cities throughout the United Kingdom, where land-owning gentry, those that inherited land and wealth, were not only the most important people in town. Those that had got a trade, that were business people that had done very well for themselves, were the new middle class. And the Bladons were part of that in Uttoxeter, and were probably the most prominent family of that new middle class in the town. And with prominence and wealth goes good living. This people will recognise is the Staffordshire Clinic, is the dentist, which is on Dove Bank and Back Lane. That over on the right hand side, to the right of the lamp post, is Thomas Lane's. That is the house of Thomas Bladon. And that area of town, including the original site on which Thomas Lane's High School now stands, was an area of significance, an area of the wealthy. It was the place to live. And Thomas Bladon and his brothers made sure that their wealth was shown by buying very significant houses within the town. This is the rectory of St Mary's Church. This also became a Bladon house. It just so happened that, as you will see a bit later, that the Bladons were the church wardens. And often the vicar of the church was also a vicar elsewhere, so was often living outside the town. So the Bladons, for a time, occupied the rectory, and when they were not occupying the rectory, made sure that they got a handsome rent as they let it. And they also lived there. This is Oldfields House, as was then, Oldfields Hall, renamed by the Bamford family. This is the home of Anne and Elizabeth and Joseph Bladon, and later Thomas Bladon. And you can see this, the trappings of wealth are being shown in the properties in which they are living. This is a great slide, but it takes a lot of reading. Because what we need to understand is a little bit about how towns worked and how towns were managed at this time. And I just digress a little bit with this slide. This shows it's a satirical drawing of what were called the select, the vestry, if you like, what we would understand as the council of the parish. This is the beginning, this is the origins of a parish council. So this is before local government, before county government. And what happened in towns and cities was that they were controlled by a select few. Non-elected, well, they self-selected themselves. It was the prominent landowners, the prominent businessmen. They might have the odd member of the gentry around the table, but essentially these are the people that mattered. Everything but everything in a town had something to do with them. And around that table of the select in Uttoxeter were the Bladons. In fact, there were at least 3 Bladons that were around that were part of that select group in Uttoxeter. So what it meant is that not only were they making lots of money, but they were also in positions of incredible power and control. And I'll give you an example of that. This slide represents some of the main activities of a town and the town at the time. And I'll just very, very quickly go through some of the things that are part of it. Education. That top left-hand slide is an early drawing of the original Thomas Elaine's High School. That was originally at the site of the factory shop opposite Waitrose. The chairman of governors at the time was one Joseph Bladon. This particular diagram is of the workhouse on the Heath. And for large periods of time, the chair of the guardians of the workhouse of Uttoxeter was Thomas Bladon. We've already talked about those very significant properties that they had around the town. And also, we've also mentioned the church quite a lot. Now, the church is very prominent. The Bladons, not only through their Windsor, their St George's Chapel Windsor connection, but also because, but through their connections to St Mary's, are very, very religious people and strongly connected to this church. One of the most prominent positions at the time of the select, that parish council equivalent that ruled the town at the time, was the church wardens. And the Bladons, in varying guises, were church wardens for about 30 years. Inevitably, therefore, through their premises, they would provide quite significant work opportunities in town. And even though they were not part of this particular almshouse in Carter Street in Uttoxeter, the Bladons themselves set up their own charities. This is the town hall. The town hall was not built at first as a centre of local government. Local government, when it was built, didn't exist. But what it was a hall for the people. It just so happened that one of the major patrons as it was being built was Thomas Bladon. On the top right-hand corner, that's a map. It's a tide map. And whenever there needed to be a local representative of a national initiative that the Victorians were gradually introducing across all towns and cities, they looked for prominent people to take on that role. And there are many of them that has the name Bladon. So in summary of all that, and I could go on for great detail, but you can see that they are in incredible positions of power. They are major decision makers for the town of Uttoxeter in the early part of the 19th century. To give you just a glimpse of what they're about, this is Joseph Bladon. Now, we know quite a lot about Joseph Bladon. He's the longest living Bladon of the time anyway, and his ledger, his financial ledger, survives, and this is it. And what we've done, Helen and I, is go through every single page of this very, very thick financial ledger. And it's basically an account book, and it's fascinating. It's full of pages like this. And this is the accounts of Joseph Bladon. And this is very typical. You don't have to know the detail, but it's very typical of the fact that here is Joseph renting a property to Dr. and Mrs. Milner on Bladon Street. And this is their rent book, or their rent record of income coming in. And it was quite typical of the time that many people rented property, and the family that owned most rented property in town was the Bladons. Give you an idea. So I've analysed all these pages, and this gives you an idea of what Joseph Bladon was about. He has 68 properties in town, or land areas in and around town, that produces for him the equivalent of £60,000 in today's money. And he'd rent out anything that he owned. A lot of it came from farming land, but he also owned significant numbers of pews in the church. Excuse me, and he rents out those as well. What he also was is a moneylender. So in the ledger, it shows he was lending money to at least 26 people. The ledger that survives is only for about, I think it's only about 8 years of his financial dealings. So we've got no idea how it stretches throughout his life, but he lends 26 people money. Typically loans are between 100, in those times 100 and 500, between £8,000 and £40,000 at a rate of between 4 to 5% per year. So he's got that income as well. And he also invests. This is his investments. You can see it's dominated in that period by his investments in railways. And it's interesting to see where he was invested. So when there's a plus, he's making money. When there's a minus, he's losing money. So you will notice that he's investing money, particularly in railways, all over the world. Cuba, Manchester and Liverpool. And there's the railway that's just been built coming into Uttoxeter, which is the North Staffordshire Railway. And you'll also notice he's invested in Uttoxeter Gasworks. And the fact is that they are, any new development in the town seems to have a Bladon on its board. So they could influence anything that was going on. Sometimes the investments weren't so good, and there you can see two in the United States that lost considerable amounts of money. But generally speaking, he's doing pretty well. He's a school governor, and we've said that. He's chair of the governors of Thomas Alane's grammar school at the time, and that was its building, a position of considerable power, particularly when the school decided in the 1840s that it wanted to move to its current site. So Joseph, being the kind person that he is, says, "I will take the building off your hands." So I don't think this will be allowed now, but as chair of the governors, he buys the school building off the school when the school moves, and then sells it onto his brother Thomas. And this the old school building then is knocked down and becomes the warehouse that we saw on an earlier slide. Joseph also provides schools. Little known is the fact that there used to be a small school on Pimfold Street, then called Pimfold Lane. So just off Bladon Street, he decides to build a church-linked school. So round the back of the houses on Bladon Street, he himself finances a school. And this is a quote from Francis Redfern, writing in 1881, after Joseph dies, describing the school that Joseph provides. So he's got his fingers in every pie, just like his brothers. He's also a considerable man of influence. It appears he's not to be crossed. This is an odd slide because it shows what's called a pamphlet. These were like the sort of stuff that you get in papers nowadays and magazines advertising this, that, the other. These were used to get a message out to the general population. As newspapers weren't that common and there were no other means of getting information out or a viewpoint out, these were often distributed around the town in prominent places and through letterboxes. This one particularly is interesting because it's a pamphlet about an argument, and the argument is between the vicar of the church, which is a chap called Clement Broughton, and the church authorities. And the church authorities just so happen to be headed up by Joseph Bladon. It's about the curate. It's a very long piece of work, but it basically, the vicar wanted more money because he couldn't afford to keep John Dashwood, the curate, and he was going to sack him. In summary, what Clement Broughton, the vicar, failed to grasp was that John Dashwood is related to the Bladons. And you can imagine who won, and it wasn't the vicar. It wasn't, Joseph Bladon wasn't a man to cross. The quote, by the way, comes from Mary Howitt, who visited, on a visit to Uttoxeter in later life, became friendly with Joseph Bladon, and as she said, the most influential man in this town. We're coming towards the end of our tree, and you've now got therefore Thomas. There's Joseph and Thomas too. These are the two that have built up this incredible empire. Both the wool, the shop, but particularly property, and particularly got themselves in amazing positions of power within the town. Thomas has these children, and the eldest surprisingly calls Thomas, and it's the young Thomas 3 that inherits the business. So you would have thought on the face of it that Thomas 3, just like his father, would be a very wealthy man and would be and his family would be wealthy for the rest of their lives. He's not doing so bad. We know by this time he's a gentleman of some considerable stature in town. He's president of, as well as his connections to the workhouse, he also is the president of a whole range of other things in town. So anything that needs a chair, it's Thomas Bladon that seems to step in there, including the library that's cited in the new hall for the people, the town hall. And most of the books are bought by the Bladon family. But he too owns at least 26 buildings and 51 pieces of land. And he should, as I say, he should be wealthy for the rest of his life, and his family should also be. But things are not quite, we've found, as they seem. We don't know whether or not he inherits the problems, or whether or not the problems are of his making. There's something going on also in the town that's not making Uttoxeter a place to be as a landowner or a tradesperson. And this slide sort of illustrates it. And I've used this slide in varying guises before. It basically shows population. And you see Uttoxeter is the middle. I put Lee where I'm sitting at the moment, and you can see Lee as a village hardly changes in its population over time. And Uttoxeter, again, is very, very, very slow growing. Now, that's in great contrast to the rapidly developing industrial towns elsewhere. And you can see this is just Longton of the potteries towns. In the same period, how it jumps from a very small village, less than the size of Lee really, to even in 1891, 34,000 people, very rapidly. These are the places like Longton and like Manchester and like Birmingham and like those industrial districts that are attracting the investment and the tradesmen and the population. Uttoxeter is not attracting them anymore. And of course, the Bladon business, both property and wool, is built on Uttoxeter and what happens in Uttoxeter. So they're not quite in the right place anymore. But there seems to be more going on, which we're still yet to find out about the Bladon wealth. It's not quite as it seems, because what we don't know is if it was real wealth, some of it, or whether it was borrowed money. What we do know is that they were living very extravagantly and very well. And what we don't know is whether or not that wealth was actually all, or that existence was all on borrowed money. We suspect it might well have been, because they couldn't certainly have a landscape in front of them that looked like an industrial landscape like that in Uttoxeter. So business wouldn't have been anywhere near as good. We get a glimpse of things are not quite as they seem when the final Thomas Bladon dies. He's quite young, and no doubt looking at and the details around his death, he obviously suffered incredibly of quite significant stress. And I'm sure it might well have been because of what the business and the family were going through. However, he was a very, very important part of the town. And you can see this, it's obituary really that was in the local paper about Thomas Bladon, how much he was lamented, what incredible support he was and his genuine kindness. And it was so important in the town that businesses closed for the day of his funeral and the blinds were drawn down. It's almost like the death of a royal. Not soon after his death, this appears in the local paper. It looks like any other advert for an auction. The auction's at the town hall. It doesn't say much about the detail of what's for sale, except there are 39 lots. What in fact those 39 lots are, we've discovered, is basically the Bladon business. The whole lot is up for sale, and the reason for that is the fact that Thomas III, the third Bladon, owes the equivalent of around just under £5 million. Now, whether or not he's inherited this debt, whether or not he's accumulated it himself, whether or not he's propping up the business, whether or not he's propping up the family property empire, we've got no idea at all. But what we do know is his lenders want their money back, and they don't have it. The Bladons don't have it. So the whole lot goes bust. The family business actually almost entirely goes bust, and the whole lot therefore has to be sold. So this is shows that they've risen to this incredible position within the town, a position of quite considerable power and wealth. But on what? It's probably shifting sand really, because they're in considerable debt, and the creditors are now coming in. They're saying we want our money back, and in fact this is the end for the Bladon Empire. From that point on time, this is the end of the Bladon Empire. It doesn't mean to say that the Bladons didn't stay in town This is the only portrait, the only photograph, the only picture of any description that we have of a Bladon. This is Mary Helen Bladon, that married into the Herbert family, that became prominent medical physicians in town. And obviously she remained, but all the Bladon children, with one exception, disappeared, moved away. And sadly, perhaps because of the stress and the strain of the loss of the business and everything that the Bladon name and its empire meant, sadly, Thomas's wife died within 18 months of him. What it also meant at this time was the Victorian government were coming to terms with and developing very new systems of delivering services in government. And what it basically meant is really that never again would the likes of the Bladons be in positions of non-elected power. So, you know, there's the town hall, but now it's called Uttoxeter Town Hall. This is the beginning, therefore, of local government, elected representatives of the people delivering services to the people, and also that the national government is imposing ways of doing things. So never again, both in Uttoxeter or anywhere else, would a family ever have that sort of power and influence. Certainly they might have the wealth, but never that power and influence that the Bladons had. And I suppose symbolically, in the 1880s, this is a plaque that's high above the buildings that are on Bear Hill, and marks a very, a symbolic end. Basically, the Bladon buildings were all knocked down and rebuilt in 1883, and their name disappears, largely disappears in town. From a position of power, they fade away, and never again would a family have so much power and influence in a town. Not even the Bamfords had the same power and influence on Uttoxeter as did the Bladons. Hope you found that interesting. And as I say, there'll be time for questions at the end. And if I get any details of the family wrong, Helena, the Bladon descendant, is online to help. And I'll just finish off, Gordon, if I may. If you're really interested, Helena and I have written a book, and here it is. It will be published hopefully before the summer by Amazon, and hopefully we'll have much cheaper copies available in the museum shop.
And I would also like to welcome Helena to the panel. Helena is one of our volunteer archivists at the museum, and also a genuine surviving Bladon, something that is a little rare by all accounts. There might have been quite a few of them in the town back in the 17th century, but there aren't too many today. So our first question comes from Stephen, and he would like to know, was there a specific type of Uttoxeter cheese? So this goes all the way back to the beginning and the cheese making parts.
Yeah, there was. We hope to do a lot more research on the cheese industry over the next 12 months. Apparently, it was very similar to a Cheshire or a Lancashire, sort of a soft, crumbly cheese. The only cheese that's made at the moment still in the Uttoxeter area is made just up the road from where I'm sitting in Lee, which is Guernsey, and the Duros family that still make it, make two versions of it, one of which is like an English version of a Brie, French cheese, but the other one is a harder cheese. So it seems, looking at the documentation, that the Uttoxeter cheese industry of the 18th and 19th centuries was of this crumbly, creamy cheese. Most people in the town, I think with the exception of the Bladons, interestingly enough, seem to have a hand in the cheese industry. Even the Bamfords had a hand in the cheese industry, but that's the sort of cheese it was.
Okay. Our next question is from Stephen again, but this time a different Stephen. So just a little bit about Oldfield House.
Yeah.
So the large mansion house shown on the slides was Oldfield House, wasn't the house that Joseph and his sisters lived in. There was a much older house on the site that Joseph lived in with his sisters. The much grander house was built by Thomas III. As people, I don't think we brought this up, but Joseph died a bachelor and left the land and the original house to his 3 nephews.
Yeah, he did. He did. Well done, Stephen. Thank you for that.
We've actually got a picture of the original house in the book, haven't we?
We have. We have.
Okay. Next questions from Alicia. So the Bladons had pride of place on the market. Did they pay rent to somebody else to trade on the market, or did they not have to pay market rates to anyone because their shop opened straight onto the marketplace?
They would have had to pay the rights to the market. The market tolls were owned by varying people over time, and they were sold on. Eventually, I think at the time of Thomas III, they would have had to pay. Certainly, if they were trading onto the market stones themselves with a stall out into the market, they would have had to pay some market fee. They would have then paid it to Bagshaws, the auctioneers who own the rights to the market tolls at that particular time. But essentially they owned the property from which they traded, either on real money or on borrowed money. They owned that property and lots of other properties that they had, certainly on Bear Hill. The Bear Hill properties, I think they were their properties, including what is Wetherspoons. The site where Wetherspoons is at the moment, that was Bladon land.
Actually, we have sort of a follow-up from Stephen and his earlier comments about Oldfield House. The question cut him off. So he just, to continue this, Thomas paid a considerable sum to his brothers for the shares and then demolished the original Oldfield House to build a much more considerable, expensive, much grander house. Sadly, he died within a couple of years of this, and the house was sold along with extensive lands for much less money. Stephen believes this is where the money went and how they found themselves in considerable.
Yeah, I think Stephen's right. I mean, thanks, Stephen. Who's I think it's the same as, I think Stephen Herbert, that's related to Helena, and knows a lot more about Oldfield House than I do. But what's interesting, Stephen's right. If you look at the sale details, not just of the house, but its interior. The auction catalogue is fascinating because it shows that it was furnished to the highest possible standard. Both the furniture and the carpets and everything that was in that house was absolutely, you know, of the sort of mansion house, stately home type standard. And I think Stephen's right there, is that they probably overstretched themselves both on building the house and furnishing the house and equipping the house. It was very, very grand and very expensive.
Okay. We also have a question from someone who would like to remain anonymous. They have an Anne Bladon who married a Philip Ponten on November the 4th of November 1734 at St. Peter's Church in Wolverhampton. They're not sure where she was born, but she died in 1766. Although Philip was from Norton in the moors of Staffordshire. Could Anne have been possibly, could the Anne Bladon have been possibly related to the Uttoxeter family? It's probably one for you, Helena.
Oh, she could be, but I've not come across her yet.
Yeah, there are.
But a lot of them in the area. Bladon was a, sort of Derbyshire, Staffordshire border area. That's where Emily comes from. So, and there were a lot of them.
There could be. I mean, like Helena said, when I've looked at the stuff that Helena's researched, I mean, the not just the blades are all over the place, and they could be connected, but I don't think, Helena, they're related to the Uttoxeter branch.
No,
I haven't come across that before. There's one branch of the family, interestingly, that Helena's too modest to say, that actually then went on, not from Uttoxeter, but the West Midlands lot, that went on to invent the blow lamp. Correct? Am I right, Helena?
Yeah, that's on mine. Yeah.
Yeah.
And they were made, they were situated in the jewellery quarter in Birmingham, and they made blow lamps and road lamps, cart lamps. I've got quite a collection at home.
Okay. Now we're getting towards the end of the questions. So if anyone else would like to add anything, now's the time to do so. Although I just have one question myself, actually, for Helena and Dave. And again, it's down towards the end of the family. I noticed that a lot of the investments seem to be in the southern part of the United States. And with the family seeming to lose a lot of money in the sort of around the early 1860s, roughly coinciding with the American Civil War. Do we know if this had an effect on their finances or not?
Well, I would have thought it would. I mean, all we've got in the ledger are the entries. There's, Helena will correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think there's any commentary as to what was going on. All it is how much money goes in or how much money goes out, and how much is gained or lost. Nothing else. But looking into it a bit further, the railway boom generally throughout Western Europe and the United States was incredibly speculative. As we know, in the UK, there were railways being set up here, there and everywhere, some of which worked and some of which didn't. The American Civil War, in the development of the railway system, I'm not an expert at all on American railways, couldn't have helped. What was already a speculative venture. But Joseph, like many businessmen like him, would have thought it was worth a punt. Unfortunately, it wasn't.
Okay, thank you. We don't appear to have had any more questions. So I think we will call the talk to a finish tonight. So I'd like to offer my thanks to Dave for presenting the talk, Helena for joining us, and as well for doing the research for the book. As mentioned earlier, that will be out this summer, available through both Amazon, and we also hope to have copies available in the museum shop.